with me now. Go with me now. I'm gonna take you down. Go with me now. I'm gonna show you how. Go with me now.
Well, hey, welcome to the Aggregate Demand lecture. To get us started, we've got this little tweet from this gossip girl, Kristen Bell. She says that rich people should pay higher taxes, and her reasoning is because they can afford it. Well, my question is, should they pay higher taxes just because they can afford it, or should we consider what that would do to the overall economy and therefore how it would affect everybody? Because it turns out taxes being raised, regardless of whether it's on the rich or the poor or whoever, always will have a negative effect on the economy. So we're going to see that today, or at least that's one of the things we're going to look at. By the way, I've noticed through the years of teaching economics that people who believe the rich should pay more in taxes oftentimes don't know what it is that they actually do pay. So I've got kind of some data from the IRS that shows you. So the rich are going to be this group down here at the bottom. So 39.6% is the tax bracket that they are in. So that means that of their income above $418,000 a year, they're paying 39.6% of. That's a pretty high tax bracket. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there for you. Additionally, I want y'all to know that the economy is very dynamic. Okay, so just because you raise taxes on the rich doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be paying more taxes, because there are ways that they can structure their income so that they can avoid those taxes. In fact, in 2008, when the top marginal tax rate was 35%, the rich paid 39% of all taxes. Okay, so 1% of the people paid 39% of the taxes. In 2011, after tax rates were raised to 39.6%, now the rich are only paying 35.1% of all the taxes. So again, just because you raise taxes on the rich doesn't mean the rich are going to pay more taxes. All right. Anyway, just thought I'd throw that out there. We're going to see how taxes affect the economy in a few minutes. So let's look at the macroeconomic focus on the business cycle. So it turns out after the Great Depression, macroeconomics became a specialized field of study in economics, and the reason was because policy makers could make decisions that could lessen the severity of the fluctuations in the business cycle. So maybe a recession could actually be shortened if we do the right things policy-wise. And so that's one of the things that we're going to be doing today, is getting a little bit of the background so that we can then, next unit, learn how to use fiscal and monetary policy to affect the business cycle. Alright, so to introduce all of this, we need to learn about aggregate demand and the aggregate supply model. Okay, so aggregate demand, when we talk about that, we're just talking about the total demand for final goods and services in the economy. If you'll remember, the final goods and services that we produce, that's basically GDP. Okay, so all of these things are very much related to each other. All right, so basically aggregate demand is the demand for everything by everyone. All right, aggregate supply, that's going to be its partner here. That is the total supply of all final goods and services in the economy. Again, final goods and services, that's GDP. So we're looking at the supply of production and then the demand for that production. That's basically what we're looking at. So aggregate supply is the supply of everything by every firm. All right. The term price level, this is just referring to that nominal variable of inflation. Okay, we will usually express this as an inflation rate, or you could use the price index. So we could say the price level is 3%, or you could use a price index of 103. Those would essentially be talking about the same thing. And then finally, real GDP. Real GDP is the economy's output of goods and services. It corrects the growth in the economy for prices. So in other words, as you recall, it's just GDP adjusted for inflation. All right, so that's the vocabulary we're going to be using today. So let's draw our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model and compare it to one that we're already familiar with, the PPC. Okay, so I'm going to start out with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So the y-axis is labeled price level. The x-axis is labeled real GDP, which is output. So you could label it either one of those things, doesn't matter which. And let's go back over here to the PPC. And we usually put capital and consumer goods on the PPC. So let me label that up, PPC. And this is the ADAS. Alright, now notice the PPC curve itself. We have a corresponding curve on the ADAS model, and that is called the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so LRAS is the long run aggregate supply curve. It is essentially what it is we are capable of producing in the long run, which is exactly what the PPC is. The PPC shows what combination of goods we can produce given all of our resources. The long run aggregate supply curve tells us the exact same thing. So if you wanted to put a number to it, so on the ADAS model, our long run aggregate supply curve is going to be equivalent to about $19 trillion worth of output. And so that's basically how we would label that. Now we're going to continue this, okay, because we have two short run curves on the ADAS model that we don't have on the PPC. So here is the short run aggregate supply curve, and here is the aggregate demand curve. Where they intersect is where the economy is at any given moment. If they intersect on the long run aggregate supply curve, that means the economy is humming along perfectly. So let's label that point A and make a corresponding point A on the PPC. Alright, so point A is showing a full employment output economy on both curves. Alright, now the ADAS graph allows us to do a little more than the PPC. So let me remind you of something. Remember, if you're producing inside the PPC, we'll call this point B, that means that you're not utilizing all of your resources. You're dealing with some sort of recession. There's unemployment. Okay, we will show the same thing on our ADAS graph by shifting the AD curve to the left. So anytime we're in a recession, we're producing less output and people are buying less output. So if you look at the new point B, at point B we've got an equilibrium that is something less than the 19 trillion that we're capable of, and that means that there's going to be higher than the natural rate of unemployment. In fact, let me put those up here as well. So at the 19 trillion mark, let's say we've got 5% unemployment. Okay, I'll label that here, unemployment. At the 19 trillion, at the less than $19 trillion GDP, we're going to have unemployment that is greater than 5%. That kind of stands to reason, right? Alright, let's move on. On the PPC, when we had this point out here, we said that that was not possible because we don't have the resources to accomplish that. Well, on the ADAS model, we're going to say that in the short run, we do have the capability of producing at point C for short periods of time. Can't do it forever. Okay? But that would correspond to some level of GDP that is greater than 19 trillion. Okay? That's why these two curves, the AD and the short run aggregate supply, they're referred to as short run curves because they demonstrate what the economy can do in the short run, whereas the long run aggregate supply curve tells us what the economy can do in the long run. So that's a little bit of information. By the way, at the greater than 19 trillion GDP, you're going to have unemployment that is something less than that 5% natural rate. So that's kind of an introduction to the model. We're gonna delve deeply into the aggregate demand curve today, and then next time we're going to cover the aggregate supply curve. So aggregate demand. This is basically just the addition of consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. So consumption is when we go shopping. You guys knew that. Investment is when businesses buy machines. Okay, government purchases, government builds roads. Net exports is our exports minus our imports. And so all of that is what comprises the aggregate demand curve. So you can imagine if any one of those increases, the aggregate demand curve is going to increase. And if any one of those decreases, let's say consumption goes down, then aggregate demand will also go down, meaning it shifts to the left. Okay? So let's talk a little more detail about the aggregate demand curve and why is it downward sloping. Now, it kind of makes sense if you just look at it, that at a lower price level, people will buy more things. And that's essentially why the curve is down sloping. But we have some economic scientific reasons for it. So we're going to look at those. So the first reason is something called the wealth effect. This is similar to the income effect when we looked at the regular demand curve. And it simply says that at lower prices, people's accumulated assets become more valuable. And at lower price levels, your wealth will purchase more. So the wealth effect is simply the change in our purchasing power that comes about by lower prices. Or it could be from higher prices. You still get a change in the purchasing power. So higher price levels are going to decrease our purchasing power, whereas lower price levels are going to increase our purchasing power. All right? So that's what we mean by the wealth effect. The second reason for the downsloping curve is called the interest rate effect. To introduce the interest rate effect, I want to remind you about the loanable funds market. So the loanable funds market helps us to demonstrate how changes in savings or borrowing can affect the interest rate. Okay? Turns out though that a higher price level is going to affect the loanable funds market, and that at a higher price level you won't be able to save as much because more of your income goes towards consumption spending. And if you can't save as much, the interest rate goes higher. Okay? And then the higher interest rate is going to have an effect on our spending, in that a lot of our spending is based on interest rates, and a lot of investment spending is based on interest rates. So, to introduce the interest rate effect, I just wanted to remind you that the loanable funds market is what determines the interest rate, and higher prices cause us to save less, which will raise the interest rate. So, this is how the interest rate effect happens. All right? The price level increases, so people need to spend a larger percentage of their income. That doesn't mean they're buying more things. They're just spending a larger percentage of their income because of higher prices. And that means they save less. That causes interest rates to rise, and then the higher interest rates reduce overall spending. And the reason they do that is because at higher interest rates, cars become more expensive to buy, houses become more expensive to buy, and a lot of investment spending is taken out of the equation because at higher interest rates, investments may not be as profitable. And so that's why we end up with less consumption spending and less investment spending. Then, if you want to kick it up a notch, remember higher interest rates are going to appreciate the dollar, and an appreciated dollar is going to decrease export spending. So a lot of things are affected by higher interest rates, and you'll see that as we move through the course. But anyway, that's the second reason for the downsloping aggregate demand curve. All right, and the last one is called the foreign purchase effect, or the international trade effect. Lower U.S. prices, Americans are going to buy more U.S. goods, but so are foreigners. And so that's why this curve is downsloping, because lower prices essentially increase the aggregate quantity demanded. And so there's an inverse relationship between the price level and the aggregate demand quantities. All right, so kind of recapping all of that. All right, let's pretend that we start right here. I'm going to call this point A. At point A, the price level is 100, and we as a society are spending $16 trillion on our GDP. All right, all of a sudden the price goes higher. Okay, so when the price moves up, whoops, let me change colors here, make this more seeable. Let's say the price moves up to, we'll just call it 102. Now, because of the wealth effect, we're going to end up spending less, and so consumption falls, and we move to what I'm going to call point B. All right. If the price level rises further, the interest rate effect kicks in, and now, because of higher interest rates, it's more expensive to borrow money for cars, it's more expensive to borrow money for factories, and so on. And so again, we change our consumption and investment and other spending patterns, and now we're at point C. And as the price level rises further, foreigners are going to begin to not buy as much, and then we end up at point D. And so it all kind of makes sense that as the price level goes higher, because of those three effects, you're going to end up with less aggregate quantity demanded. Okay? Now, lucky for us, we're really going to be more concerned with things that actually shift the aggregate demand curve. Okay? And so non-price level changes will cause consumption, investment, government, and exports to change, in which case the whole aggregate demand curve shifts. So the curve can shift to the right if there's an increase in consumption or investment or government or exports, or it can shift to the left if there's a decrease in those things. All right? So basically, we're going to look at what is it that might cause consumption spending to change, investment spending to change, government spending to change, and then export spending to change. All right? So we're going to brainstorm. And since you're not with me, I'm going to brainstorm. All right, so first, and by the way, you can think of these things as well. You can probably anticipate what I might write down. So I'm going to write down things that will increase consumption spending that have nothing to do with the price level. Okay? So let's see. How about if our income rises? Okay? If I get a raise, I'm going to go buy more things. Okay? So income rises or increases. Increases in income, basically. All right, that's one thing. You could have lower interest rates. Okay, lower interest rates outside of changes in the price level. I mean, the price level stays exactly the same, but then interest rates are lower. That is going to cause me to maybe go out and buy a new car, or refinance my house and then use the extra money to go buy something else. The point is that lower interest rates free up some of our money that we spend on debt servicing, and that allows us to go spend more. All right. Here's one that's kind of out there, but it works. I'm going to say higher anticipated inflation. Okay, let me explain that one to you. So you might decide that you need to go spend your paycheck before it's worth less if you think there's going to be heavy inflation. So maybe I'm in the market for a car and I was planning on waiting until next year to buy it, but I heard that inflation is going to be 10%. Well, that would mean that if I wait till next year, that car is going to cost 10% more. So maybe I don't want to wait, and so I'm going to increase my spending today. How about this thing? Lower taxes. Okay, if I don't have to spend as much of my paycheck on taxes, then I have more to buy other goods. And so those are all things that will increase consumption spending. You could continue this list. You could make this list even bigger. I mean, I'll keep going, I guess. How about consumer confidence? What this is referring to is just how you feel the economy is doing. Or what do you think your future pay might be? You know, if you think the economy is strong, you're going to get a raise in the future, you'll go out and spend money today. So, and again, you could keep on going. So I'm gonna stop now. I'll give you a decent list in a little while. What will increase investment spending? So again, we're brainstorming, and a little secret: businesses respond to the very same and similar incentives that consumers do. So how about increased profits? All right. How about lower taxes? Okay, there's a proposal to drop the corporate tax rate from 38% down to 20%. Do you think that might give businesses an incentive to go make some investments? You know, rebuild the factory or whatever. How about lower interest rates? And then we discussed when we learned about the loanable funds market, we learned about how increased productivity of capital will tend to cause businesses to go borrow money and purchase that investment good. What else? Oh yeah, how about investor confidence? So again, just confidence in how the economy is doing. Okay, so and by the way, again, we could keep on going. I mean, there's all kinds of things we could do here. All right, so that's increases in investment spending. How about what will increase government spending on goods and services? Well, that picture is a pretty good indication. How about war? Okay, that could do it. Infrastructure spending. Okay, just a desire to spend more on the infrastructure. Really, it's anything. How about this? Anything. Okay, the government doesn't really respond to their income levels, and they don't respond to interest rates because they don't care. So really, it's any time they want to spend more money, you would see aggregate demand increase. If the government decides to spend less money, you're going to see aggregate demand decrease. All right, and then lastly, what will increase export spending? Well, we learned a little bit about this stuff when we covered the foreign exchange market, right? So let's think of some things that will cause foreigners to increase their purchases of U.S. goods. How about increased income by those foreigners, increased income overseas? How about, let's see, lower interest rates again? And the reason I say that is because that would cause the dollar to depreciate. So really, that's a reason by itself. The dollar depreciates. You could add more. I mean, it's just whatever motivates a foreigner to buy a U.S. good, that will increase export spending. All right, so let's recap all that. So the domestic factors that can shift aggregate demand: anything that changes major spending habits of individuals, firms, the government, or foreigners. Well, domestics and not foreigners. This includes changes in real wealth, expected income, expected price levels. So some examples: the stock market goes up or down. If the stock market goes up, people feel confident about the economy, they go spend money. All right, same thing with real estate values. I bought my house 4 years ago. It's already worth twice as much as I paid for it. That's ridiculous. But it makes me feel pretty confident about the future, and so I don't mind spending money. Okay. Changes in consumer confidence, changes in business leaders' confidence, we address those things. Changes in interest rates. Lower interest rates increase spending, higher interest rates decrease spending. And then, of course, changes in government spending. On the international side, it could be foreign income and wealth changes. So foreign nations become wealthier, they're gonna increase their purchases of U.S. goods. If a foreign nation goes into a recession, they're gonna decrease their purchase of U.S. goods. And then the exchange rate of the dollar. If the value of the dollar goes up, U.S. citizens can buy more goods from foreigners, but foreigners will end up buying fewer goods from the U.S. All right, and so that's how all of that affects the aggregate demand curve. So there are an additional list of examples, little exercises. I want you to go through those and see if you can choose correctly which way the aggregate demand curve shifts, and that's where we'll start in class. We'll go over those to make sure everybody understands. All right, have a great day.